Donald Trump. Donald Trump served as the 45th President of the United States from 2017 to 2021, emerging as a controversial figure even before taking office due to his unorthodox rise in politics. A real estate magnate and television personality with no prior political or military experience, Trump leveraged a populist, America First platform that resonated with many Americans feeling left behind by globalization. His presidency was marked by significant policy changes, polarizing rhetoric, and an unconventional leadership style. One of his most contentious initiatives was his hardline immigration stance, which included implementing a travel ban on several Muslim-majority countries and a zero-tolerance policy that led to family separations at the US-Mexico border, drawing condemnation from human rights groups. Trump's handling of climate change also sparked global outrage. He withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, championed fossil fuels, and rolled back numerous environmental regulations. Economically, his administration enacted the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which was praised for lowering corporate tax rates but criticized for disproportionately benefiting the wealthy. Internationally, his relationships with authoritarian leaders like Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, coupled with strained ties with NATO allies, left a mixed legacy. His America First approach was seen as a retreat from global leadership. Trump's presidency faced significant legal and ethical controversies, culminating in 2 impeachments. The first was tied to allegations that he pressured Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden's son, using military aid as leverage. The second followed the January 6, 2021 Capitol riots, during which a mob of his supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol after Trump's repeated false claims of election fraud. Trump's refusal to concede the 2020 election and efforts to overturn its results further divided the nation. Despite these controversies, his base remained fervently loyal, seeing him as a disruptor of the political establishment. Trump's presidency significantly altered the Republican Party and left a deeply polarized America in its wake. Jair Bolsonaro. Jair Bolsonaro, president of Brazil from 2019 to 2022, is one of the most polarizing figures in modern South American politics. A former army captain, Bolsonaro rose to power on a wave of right-wing populism, promising to restore law and order and combat corruption. His presidency, however, was mired in controversies ranging from environmental policies to his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Bolsonaro's administration faced global criticism for its lax approach to deforestation in the Amazon rainforest, which saw record-breaking levels of destruction during his tenure. Environmentalists accused him of prioritizing agribusiness interests over climate concerns, which Bolsonaro dismissed as foreign interference. Domestically, his pandemic response sparked outrage, as he downplayed the severity of COVID-19, opposed lockdowns, and promoted unproven treatments like hydroxychloroquine. These actions contributed to Brazil becoming one of the worst-hit countries during the pandemic. Bolsonaro's divisive rhetoric, often targeting LGBTQ+ communities, indigenous groups, and political opponents, further polarized Brazilian society. Supporters admired his strongman image and focus on traditional values, but critics condemned his disregard for democracy and human rights. Bolsonaro's tenure reshaped Brazil's political landscape, highlighting deep societal divisions while leaving an enduring legacy of contention. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, 1969 to 1974, is best known for the Watergate scandal, which led to his resignation, the first and only U.S. president to do so. Initially, Nixon was praised for significant achievements in foreign policy, including opening diplomatic relations with China, initiating détente with the Soviet Union, and ending American involvement in the Vietnam War. However, his legacy was overshadowed by Watergate, where members of his administration were implicated in a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. The subsequent cover-up, orchestrated by Nixon and his aides, unraveled through investigative journalism and congressional hearings, exposing widespread corruption. Nixon's use of federal agencies to target political enemies further tarnished his image. Before the scandal, Nixon's domestic policies also stirred controversy, such as his handling of desegregation and mixed success with economic issues, including implementing wage and price controls during inflation. Although he resigned to avoid impeachment, Nixon's resignation deepened public distrust in government institutions. Despite the scandal, Nixon's foreign policy expertise and pragmatic approach to governance continue to be reassessed, making his presidency a symbol of both high achievement and ethical failure. Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia since 1999, excluding his term as prime minister from 2008 to 2012, is one of the most controversial leaders in modern history. His tenure has been characterized by authoritarianism, international aggression, and a tightening grip on Russian society. Domestically, Putin has consolidated power by eliminating political opposition, controlling media outlets, and altering the constitution to remain in power potentially until 2036. Critics accuse him of undermining Russian democracy and fostering a regime of corruption where oligarchs loyal to him thrive. Human rights organizations frequently highlight the suppression of dissent, including the imprisonment and poisoning of opposition figures like Alexei Navalny. Journalists critical of the Kremlin have faced harassment, violence, and even death under suspicious circumstances. On the international stage, Putin has pursued an aggressive foreign policy aimed at restoring Russia's influence as a global power. His annexation of Crimea in 2014, following a controversial referendum, violated international law and sparked widespread condemnation and sanctions. The ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine, escalated by Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, has drawn accusations of war crimes and led to global isolation. Putin's military interventions extend beyond Ukraine. He played a decisive role in the Syrian civil war by supporting Bashar al-Assad, which many viewed as exacerbating civilian suffering. His cyber campaigns, including alleged interference in the 2016 US presidential election, have further damaged his reputation. Supporters, however, admire Putin's projection of strength, framing him as a defender of Russian sovereignty against Western influence. Despite these controversies, Putin remains a dominant figure in global politics, symbolizing both power and authoritarianism. Rodrigo Duterte. Rodrigo Duterte served as the president of the Philippines from 2016 to 2022, leaving behind a legacy defined by his brutal war on drugs and his authoritarian style of governance. Duterte campaigned on a platform of eradicating crime and corruption, but his methods sparked intense international and domestic criticism. His anti-drug campaign, launched immediately upon taking office, resulted in thousands of extrajudicial killings as police and vigilantes targeted suspected drug users and dealers. Human rights organizations accused Duterte of enabling state-sanctioned murder, with many victims reportedly innocent or denied due process. Despite widespread condemnation, Duterte remained unapologetic, even boasting about personally killing suspected criminals during his time as a mayor. Duterte's controversial rhetoric further alienated critics and polarized the Filipino public. He often made inflammatory statements, including sexist remarks and threats against journalists and political opponents. His administration also weakened democratic institutions by attacking press freedom and consolidating power. The closure of ABS-CBN, a major media network critical of Duterte, highlighted concerns about press suppression. On foreign policy, Duterte pivoted away from traditional alliances with the United States, seeking closer ties with China despite ongoing disputes over the South China Sea. This approach frustrated many Filipinos, as Chinese encroachment on Philippine territorial waters remained a contentious issue. Nevertheless, Duterte retained significant support, especially among the working class, who credited him with improving public safety and infrastructure. His tough-on-crime persona and populist rhetoric resonated with many, though his critics argue that his policies left lasting damage to Philippine democracy and human rights. Duterte's presidency remains a contentious chapter in Philippine history, symbolizing both populist appeal and authoritarian excess. Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini, the founder of fascism and the leader of Italy from 1922 to 1943, is one of history's most infamous and controversial figures. Rising to power during a period of post-World War I economic and social turmoil, Mussolini positioned himself as the strongman who would restore Italy's glory. He established a totalitarian regime that suppressed political opposition, controlled the press, and promoted intense nationalism. Mussolini's rule saw the implementation of corporatism as an economic system, which sought to mediate conflicts between employers and workers through state-controlled syndicates. However, his policies primarily benefited the elite and exacerbated inequalities. Mussolini's foreign policy aimed to create a new Roman Empire, leading to aggressive military campaigns. His invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 was marked by the use of chemical weapons and brutal tactics, drawing condemnation from the international community. Mussolini later aligned Italy with Nazi Germany during World War II, forming the Axis powers. This alliance dragged Italy into catastrophic conflicts and tied Mussolini to Adolf Hitler's genocidal policies. Domestically, Mussolini introduced racial laws in 1938, discriminating against Jews and other minorities, which solidified his regime's fascist ideology. Mussolini's downfall began with Italy's military failures in World War II. As Allied forces advanced, his support eroded, and he was deposed in 1943. He was captured and executed by Italian partisans in 1945. While Mussolini is remembered as a dictator who caused immense suffering, some of his policies, such as infrastructure projects and modernization efforts, are occasionally acknowledged by his supporters. However, his legacy is overwhelmingly seen as one of oppression, militarism, and the disastrous consequences of fascism. Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945, remains one of the most infamous and controversial figures in history. Hitler rose to power during a period of economic and social turmoil in post-World War I Germany, exploiting widespread discontent with the Treaty of Versailles and the Great Depression. As Chancellor and later Führer, he dismantled Germany's democratic institutions, establishing a totalitarian regime based on the ideology of National Socialism, which promoted Aryan racial superiority, anti-Semitism, and extreme nationalism. Hitler's policies targeted Jewish people, Romani people, disabled individuals, and other marginalized groups, culminating in the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others. Hitler's expansionist ambitions led to the outbreak of World War II in 1939, following Germany's invasion of Poland. Under his leadership, Nazi Germany aggressively annexed or conquered much of Europe, employing blitzkrieg tactics. While initially achieving significant military successes, Hitler's strategic decisions, such as invading the Soviet Union and declaring war on the United States, ultimately led to Germany's defeat. The war caused unprecedented destruction, with an estimated 70–85 million deaths, including civilian casualties and genocide victims. Domestically, Hitler's propaganda machinery, led by Joseph Goebbels, ensured that dissent was crushed, and his regime controlled all aspects of German life. He fostered a cult of personality, portraying himself as Germany's savior while suppressing opposition through institutions like the Gestapo and concentration camps. Despite these atrocities, Hitler gained the loyalty of many Germans during his early years in power due to economic recovery programs and nationalist rhetoric. His regime's construction of infrastructure, such as the Autobahn, and promises of restoring Germany's former glory temporarily masked his brutal policies. However, by the war's end, Hitler's legacy was one of unparalleled destruction and moral corruption. His suicide in April 1945 marked the end of Nazi rule, leaving behind a world irrevocably scarred by his actions. Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea since 2011, is one of the most enigmatic and controversial leaders of the 21st century. Inheriting power from his father, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un maintained the family's dynastic rule, characterized by strict authoritarianism and a pervasive cult of personality. His leadership has been marked by an aggressive nuclear weapons program, severe human rights abuses, and the continued isolation of North Korea from the rest of the world. Kim has overseen numerous missile tests, including those capable of reaching the United States, sparking global condemnation and severe sanctions. His government's rhetoric often involves threats of annihilation against South Korea and the United States, heightening tensions on the Korean peninsula. Domestically, Kim presides over a brutal regime that controls nearly every aspect of its citizens' lives. North Koreans are subject to severe censorship, propaganda, and a rigid caste system that dictates their social status. Dissent is met with harsh punishment, including execution or imprisonment in labor camps, where conditions are reportedly inhumane. Under Kim's rule, high-profile purges and executions of top officials, including his own uncle, have demonstrated his ruthless consolidation of power. Despite these actions, Kim has occasionally attempted to present himself as a diplomatic figure. His summits with U.S. President Donald Trump between 2018 and 2019 marked an unprecedented shift in North Korea's international relations. However, these meetings failed to produce lasting agreements, and tensions resumed shortly thereafter. Critics argue that Kim used the summits to gain legitimacy on the global stage while continuing his nuclear ambitions. Within North Korea, Kim maintains tight control through propaganda that glorifies his leadership, perpetuating the narrative that he is a defender of the nation against foreign enemies. His regime remains a symbol of repression and militarism, with little sign of reform or openness. Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez, president of Venezuela from 1999 to 2013, remains a polarizing figure whose socialist policies and charismatic leadership left a profound impact on his country and the world. Chavez rose to power on a wave of populism, promising to empower the poor and dismantle Venezuela's corrupt political elite. His Bolivarian revolution was based on a mix of socialist ideology, anti-imperialism, and nationalism. Chavez implemented sweeping reforms, including land redistribution, price controls, and nationalization of key key industries such as oil, telecommunications, and electricity. These policies initially reduced poverty and improved access to healthcare and education, earning him widespread support among Venezuela's lower classes. However, Chávez's economic policies ultimately contributed to long-term instability. His government's reliance on oil revenues to fund social programs made Venezuela highly vulnerable to fluctuations in global oil prices. When oil prices collapsed in the late 2000s, the economy entered a downward spiral. Chávez's administration faced accusations of mismanagement and corruption, as well as stifling the private sector. Politically, Chávez concentrated power in the executive branch, bypassing democratic institutions and suppressing opposition through media control and intimidation. Critics accused him of eroding democracy by extending presidential terms and limiting press freedom, while his supporters saw him as a champion of social justice and anti-colonial resistance. On the international stage, Chávez aligned Venezuela with leftist leaders like Fidel Castro and vocally opposed U.S. influence in Latin America. He often used fiery rhetoric to criticize global capitalism and portrayed himself as a defender of the global South. Chávez's death in 2013 marked the end of an era, but his policies and leadership style left Venezuela deeply divided. The economic and political crisis that unfolded after his death, under his successor Nicolas Maduro, further tarnished his legacy. While some still view Chávez as a hero who stood up for the poor, others blame his policies for plunging Venezuela into chaos. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, president of Iran from 2005 to 2013, was a deeply polarizing figure, both domestically and internationally. A populist leader with a background in engineering and local governance, Ahmadinejad's presidency was marked by his confrontational rhetoric, controversial nuclear policies, and allegations of human rights abuses. Domestically, he portrayed himself as a champion of the poor, implementing subsidies and low-cost housing projects. However, his economic policies, which included heavy government spending and an overhaul of subsidies, were criticized for contributing to inflation and unemployment. Corruption and inefficiency within his administration further worsened Iran's economic woes, exacerbating discontent among Iranians. Ahmadinejad's second-term election in 2009 triggered mass protests, known as the Green Movement, after widespread allegations of electoral fraud. The government's brutal suppression of these demonstrations, which included arrests, torture, and deaths, drew international condemnation and highlighted the regime's authoritarian nature. His presidency was also marked by restrictions on press freedom, political dissent, and civil liberties, which alienated many Iranians and human rights groups. On the global stage, Ahmadinejad's nuclear ambitions placed Iran in direct conflict with Western powers. His administration aggressively pursued uranium enrichment, claiming it was for peaceful purposes, while the international community feared it was for developing nuclear weapons. This led to crippling economic sanctions against Iran, further isolating the country. Ahmadinejad's incendiary rhetoric, including denying the Holocaust and calling for the eradication of Israel, made him a pariah in the West while solidifying his image as a defiant leader in parts of the Middle East. His legacy is one of deep division, both within Iran and in its relations with the world, leaving a complicated and contentious mark on modern Iranian history. Nicolas Maduro. Nicolas Maduro, who succeeded Hugo Chavez as president of Venezuela in 2013, has been at the center of one of the most profound political and economic crises in the country's history. A former bus driver and trade union leader, Maduro inherited Chávez's socialist policies but lacked his predecessor's charisma and political acumen. Under Maduro's leadership, Venezuela descended into economic collapse, with hyperinflation reaching unprecedented levels, leading to severe shortages of food, medicine, and basic goods. The nation's reliance on oil exports, coupled with falling oil prices, left the economy in ruins. Critics accuse Maduro of exacerbating the crisis through corruption, economic mismanagement, and failure to diversify Venezuela's economy. Maduro's political practices have been equally controversial. Facing widespread opposition, he consolidated power by undermining democratic institutions, including dissolving the opposition-led National Assembly and creating a new legislative body loyal to his regime. Allegations of electoral fraud have marred multiple elections, leading many countries to refuse to recognize him as Venezuela's legitimate leader. His administration has been accused of human rights abuses, including the arbitrary detention and torture of political opponents, violent crackdowns on protests, and suppression of press freedom. Internationally, Maduro has faced condemnation and sanctions from countries such as the United States, Canada, and members of the European Union. However, he has retained support from allies like Russia, China, and Cuba, allowing him to cling to power despite calls for his resignation. Millions of Venezuelans have fled the country, creating one of the largest migration crises in modern history. While his supporters view him as a defender of Chávez's socialist vision, critics see him as a dictator dictator responsible for Venezuela's humanitarian disaster. Maduro's presidency remains a flashpoint for debates over governance, ideology, and the future of Venezuela. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, the 32nd President of the United States, served an unprecedented 4 terms from 1933 to 1945, becoming one of the most influential yet controversial leaders in American history. FDR's leadership during the Great Depression and World War II earned him immense popularity, but his policies and decisions also provoked significant criticism. The cornerstone of his presidency was the New Deal, a series of government programs and reforms designed to alleviate poverty, revive the economy, and provide jobs. While the New Deal achieved notable successes, such as Social Security, banking reforms, and public works projects, it also drew criticism for expanding federal government power. Conservatives accused Roosevelt of overreach, arguing that his programs veered toward socialism and stifled free enterprise. During World War II, FDR's leadership in mobilizing the U.S. war effort and forming alliances with other allied powers was critical to defeating Axis forces. However, his wartime policies also sparked controversy, particularly the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of whom were U.S. citizens, in response to fears of espionage. This decision is now widely condemned as a violation of civil liberties. Additionally, FDR faced criticism for his handling of racial inequality, as he often avoided addressing segregation and civil rights issues to maintain support from Southern Democrats. FDR's attempt to pack the Supreme Court by proposing an increase in the number of justices also fueled accusations of authoritarian tendencies. While he justified the move as a way to overcome judicial opposition to the New Deal, it was widely viewed as a threat to the separation of powers. Despite these controversies, FDR's presidency is often celebrated for its transformative impact on the U.S., reshaping the role of government in economic and social policy. His leadership during 2 of the most challenging periods in American history ensures his place as one of the most influential and debated figures in the nation's history. Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, since 2012 and President of China since 2013, is a highly controversial figure due to his consolidation of power and his policies at home and abroad. Xi has centralized authority to an unprecedented degree, positioning himself as the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. Under his leadership, term limits for the presidency were abolished, allowing him to remain in power indefinitely. Domestically, Xi launched an anti-corruption campaign that targeted thousands of officials, including high-ranking party members. While some saw it as a genuine effort to clean up corruption, critics argued it was a tool to eliminate political rivals and consolidate control. Xi's government has been accused of severe human rights abuses, particularly in Xinjiang, where over 1 million Uyghur Muslims have been detained in re-education camps. Reports of forced labor, cultural erasure, and mass surveillance have sparked international condemnation. Additionally, his administration has cracked down on dissent in Hong Kong, effectively dismantling its autonomy through the controversial national security law, which criminalizes acts of dissent and protest. Freedom of speech and the press have been curtailed, with strict internet censorship and increased repression of activists and journalists. On the global stage, Xi's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, has expanded China's influence through massive infrastructure investments across Asia, Africa, and beyond. Critics argue the BRI traps developing nations in debt and serves as a tool for geopolitical leverage. Xi's assertive foreign policy has led to increased tensions with countries like the United States, India, and Australia, particularly over territorial disputes in the South China Sea and Taiwan. While his supporters credit him with modernizing China and elevating its global standing, detractors warn that his authoritarian policies and ambitions for dominance pose threats to human rights, regional stability, and global democracy. Muammar Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi, who ruled Libya from 1969 to 2011, is remembered as one of the most eccentric and controversial leaders in modern history. Gaddafi seized power in a bloodless coup, overthrowing Libya's monarchy and establishing a regime based on his unique political philosophy outlined in his Green Book. Initially admired for his nationalist and anti-colonial stance, Gaddafi used Libya's vast oil wealth to fund development projects, raising the country's literacy rates and improving healthcare. However, his rule soon became synonymous with authoritarianism, brutality, and widespread human rights abuses. Gaddafi suppressed dissent through arbitrary arrests, torture, and public executions, fostering an atmosphere of fear. On the international stage, Gaddafi pursued an aggressive foreign policy, funding various militant and terrorist groups, including the Irish Republican Army, IRA, and Palestinian factions. Libya's involvement in the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, which killed 270 people, made Gaddafi a pariah in the West. His regime was subjected to sanctions, and Libya faced global isolation for years. Gaddafi's erratic behavior, extravagant lifestyle, and flamboyant fashion choices further added to his notoriety, making him a controversial figure both in diplomacy and the media. In 2011, during the Arab Spring uprisings, anti-government protests erupted in Libya, leading to a brutal civil war. Gaddafi's forces responded with extreme violence, prompting NATO intervention. As the conflict escalated, Gaddafi was captured and killed by rebel forces, marking the end of his 4-decade rule. Libya descended into chaos after his death, with rival factions vying for power, leading some to argue that his authoritarian rule, while oppressive, maintained stability. Gaddafi's legacy is deeply divisive. Some remember him as a champion of Pan-Africanism and an opponent of Western imperialism, while others see him as a dictator who enriched himself while oppressing his people. I know you were expecting more video like this. So, hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world, and it helps me bringing you more content.